I think what's happened overall, and I'm just one of literally millions of parents that have experienced this, the pandemic opened this door for
Sure.
parents to see into the classroom for the first time. And all across the country, all of a sudden, parents realized, oh my God, my child isn't being taught how to read. My child isn't being taught how to do math.
My name is Frank Schaeffer, and this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, my podcast. And my guest today is Dr. Irene Daria, PhD. Dr. Daria is a cognitive developmental psychologist and reading tutor to the stars, including the children of Kate Winslet, Tom Brady, and Kate Blanchett. She is the author of I Didn't Believe Him. My son told me his school wasn't teaching him to read. And I'm going to introduce you by looking at some things here a little more extensively here that is so interesting because you've written on other stuff. You've worked as a reporter at Women's Wear Daily and editor at Harper's Bazaar. You've written hundreds of articles for publications ranging from the New York Times to Money to Parents, Mademoiselle, and Glamour. You're also the author of 4 books that I want to mention and ask you about. The one we're doing today, I Didn't Believe Him, about your son's learning to read, The Fashion Cycle, Lutece, and which is a restaurant, and A Woman Doctor's Guide to Miscarriage, which I also want to ask you about, as well as the Steps to Reading workbook series. You're a passionate literary advocate, and you live with your husband in Manhattan and Amagassett, New York, and you're the proud mother of 2 adult sons. Okay, so that's the preamble. I want to thank you for being with us today and tell you that your book, I really enjoyed it. I'd like to put it on our book club. I think maybe it'll be in March. We have something called It Has to Be Read, and we feature a book and push it hard on back in terms of, promotion and so forth. So that would be good. And
That'll be amazing. Thank you.
yeah, I went to private boys' boarding schools in the UK in the early 60s when I started. I was born in 1952, so I'm 72. And I was sort of an undiagnosed dyslexic, which I've written about in several places. One of them, a best-selling memoir I wrote called Crazy for God, and other places. I had a son, Francis, who actually intersects very well with your sons, even though he's much older than them. He's, I think, 47 now. And he sort of was like me. Not his difficulty in learning was not related to being taught something other than the phonics you advocate. It was similar to my situation. We found him very good help in the 1980s from 2 incredibly great women. He's gone on to do something similar to your son. And after graduating from Georgetown School of Foreign Service and being all set to go to the State Department, he decided instead to go back and take a quote unquote temporary job at his old private school where he went in Massachusetts called the Waring School, which is a French-English bilingual school. And after a couple of years teaching there, which turned into a real vocation, he took a sabbatical, went back to school, went to Harvard, did physics, came back and organized something. And now this is on your son's turf, both coding projects, but also created a makerspace that he got funding for. And Waring School, amazingly, miracle of miracles, with less than 200 students, it's a very small school, went on to win the World Robotics Championship. The Waring team was sent to Singapore to represent the United States. And
Wow.
Francis then was consulted by the governor of New Hampshire, who flew to Singapore to meet with him about this and starting a similar program for the whole public school program there. He has 110 school programs in Africa that he's helped run, coding, computers, computer robots, teaching. So this is how this dyslexic boy who also had troubles wound up, very much, and I'm cutting to the chase in your book, very much like your brilliant sons. And your son in particular, you talk about Eric, I think, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who I followed with great interest and great empathy, because staring at pages and seeing things backwards and so forth and so on. All those spelling tests I was given in British boys' schools, very fortunately with very compassionate people who simply made up in kindness what they lacked in formal knowledge. But I can't imagine what I would have done if I had been confronted with the educational project you talk about in the New York public schools at the time, trying to identify pictures and memorize words. Had I not been taught in a very traditional pre-fancy way, I
I
don't think
love
I ever
that
would have made
term,
it.
pre-fancy,
Yeah, pre-fancy way.
pre-fancy.
And I wound up as a best-selling author and writer. So I'm someone who came from a background that you would have said, pick somebody in this classroom who will not be a writer and probably will not do anything, and it would have been me. Um, so I just want to say that that's a long preamble to say that I love your book, and it spoke to me personally because I was right there with you, both as a parent and a grandparent, but also with a son who's an educator and a son who was dyslexic, which your son was not dyslexic when they tested him, but had difficulty because of the stupidity of the teaching system that you then went up against and have done a lot to combat and also to answer. So, I am a big fan of your book, and I'm a big fan of you as a mother and a parent and an educator and all the rest of it. And we've never met, but some books are just another book. This book was really personal to me. Long preamble, sorry.
Love it. Thank you. It meant a lot hearing that.
Yeah, so let's cut to the chase and get into your book. I asked you a moment ago if you could mark a passage I want you to read, and I'm going to kind of open this discussion with you reading a bit from your book. I won't make you read more stuff. Speaking of, getting people to do tough things, but if you'll read this to us, it's self-explanatory. Let's just go for it, and then we can talk about the passage.
Sure. People remember exactly where they were and what they were doing when they learned about terrorist attacks, assassinations, or stock market crashes. I remember how cold the wooden floor felt as I sat on the edge of my bed and listened to my father's grief-stricken voice tell me my mother had died. I remember the events of September 11th in vivid Technicolor detail. Carrie, my husband, had been inside the World Trade Center when the first plane struck. Learning of the attack, fearing he was dead, hours later seeing my husband walk into the lobby of our apartment building and realizing he was alive. Those moments are permanently etched into my brain. So is my first conversation with reading specialist. She called while I was sitting at a cafe in a New Age store on Lower Fifth Avenue. The scent of curry and cardamom filled the air. At shiny white tables, people were sipping herbal tea and eating entrees containing tofu. I was putting finishing touches on a blog I had just started called Helicopter Mom. The blog focused on how much work New York City parents had to do to support their kids in school and the toll it was taking on parents. I hoped someone in power at the Department of Education would read it and do something to change the madness families in New York City were experiencing thanks to constructive math and balanced literacy. It seemed like we were all educating our kids at home.
Yeah, I love that passage. And it's from late in the book. It's from like page 127 in the Kindle edition I wrote. But I kind of pulled it out because it sort of sets up the struggle well. And also, I love the way as a parent, you frame this thing of, your blood kind of runs cold and you remember the place you were when it kind of dawned on you that, you were going to have to teach your child yourself because the school had completely dropped the ball. So let's just start with the basic framework here. Um, from the book, which I'm going to say again, is I didn't believe him, and can be summarized as my son told me his school wasn't teaching him to read. This is when he was 5 at first, right?
5 years old, kindergarten.
Yeah, kindergarten. My school's not teaching me to read. I told him to trust his teacher. And this is the story of what happened next. And what happened is you gave him some bad information because trusting his teacher was not the problem. The problem was the system. So let's do a broad strokes thing here for people who haven't read the book yet. Describe how people used to learn to read when people found reading easier, if you want to put it that way, and actually managed to become literate. And in broad strokes, and I know you named some names and you can name them here as well, Give me the story of your book in terms of what you discovered through the process of just watching your own son who wasn't being taught to read, in terms of these new forms, what I call these fancy forms of education, this kind of academic, you know, group of people who came up with these theories that didn't really work in real practice. I guess you could say they dominated education in one way or another from the 70s through the 90s and then beyond. But these ideas really come out of a kind of a 1960s context. And then they move into the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. You have a couple people you name, one woman in particular, who at the end of the book, you actually call out for never apologizing for her grand theories. So give me the grand theories that broke with tradition that had worked in math and literacy. Let's just start with that, and then let's get to your book.
Okay, this is going to be a little bit of a long story because it actually, yes, it does, it is the 70s and the 90s and it is the 1960s, but it actually, believe it or not, goes all the way back to the 1920s.
Sure.
So we'll say over a century ago, children were taught to read using phonics. And what that means is you teach children to sound out words so that when they encounter a word they've never seen before, they can tackle it. They can sound it out and figure it out. Horace Mann, who is considered the father of public school education in our country, and he also established the first teachers' college in our country. Very important to know those two facts. This happened in the late 1800s. He was anti-phonics. And in Boston, some schools did away with phonics. That did not stick because the Boston schoolmasters basically had a fit and said this isn't working. We want phonics. Schools went back to phonics. And kids learned to read. Then came the 1920s, the progressive era, when we saw a lot of change in a lot of different areas in our country. And one of those areas was education. In the 1920s, phonics was tossed out of schools and replaced by a method. It's important to know this because it really sets up the context for how this could have possibly ever happened in schools. So phonics was tossed out of school, and a method of learning called look-say predominated in our schools. The Dick and Jane books were used within the look-say curriculum. They actually were the curriculum. And within that curriculum, children learned to read only the words in those little books. So like, oh, Jane, see Sally, look, Dick. Those are the words that they learned. So like 13 little words, nothing else. The fact that the alphabet existed wasn't even mentioned in this curriculum.
Sure.
They were told to memorize words as whole units. Now, this fit in with a theory of psychology that was popular at the time called Gestalt psychology. That believed that we process things as whole units. That was disproven. The fact that that was disproven, Gestalt psychology, never reached the colleges of education. They're completely separate on campuses and they don't communicate with each other. So Dick and Jane continued in our schools. A man called Samuel Orton, he is the founder. I'm sure you're familiar with the Orton-Gillingham method of teaching. That's like the gold standard for teaching dyslexic children how to read today. And basically it's phonetic. He worked in schools in the 1920s. He was the very first one to notice that this new method of teaching was causing children to become dyslexic. Quote unquote. I use that, I don't like to throw that term around because true dyslexia is neurologically based. People also use it to apply when it's environmentally based, caused by the school. But he wrote a paper that was published in the Journal of Educational Psychology saying this new sight word method of teaching was actually causing children to become dyslexic. Completely ignored. 30 years later, a book called Why Johnny, I'm going to jump because I know we don't have a lot of time and there's a lot of information.
Take all the time you want. Take all the time.
Okay. Thank you. In the 1950s, a book called Why Johnny Can't... Now, in the meantime, kids were not learning how to read. Life magazine did a huge article in the early 1950s about this. Parents were going into schools and asking for phonics. It's exactly like what's happening now, a long time ago. And Rudolf Fleisch wrote Why Johnny Can't Read, and he was the first one to ever publicly say, the reason the kids are not learning is because of this look, say, whole word method of memorizing words.
Yeah.
And it caused a tremendous uproar, got a lot of attention, and schools, the supposedly were going to go back to phonics. Some schools did. Most schools did not, because what happened was a man named Kenneth Goodman in 1967 wrote a paper in which he talked about watching children read passages that were above their reading level, that had words that were new to them. And he noticed that these readers did three things. They used context to guess what the words could be. They used pictures to try to figure out what the words were. And they used the first letter of a word to try to figure out the word. And he noticed, and this is where science can be so, I hate to use the word dangerous because I'm a big fan of science, but if it's not interpreted properly, it's like, oh my God. He noticed they made the most mistakes when using just the first letter of a word. And therefore, this man, Kenneth Goodman, concluded that this is how we all read, that this is a good thing, that this is what children should do. And because but this is actually what dyslexic kids do, as you know. They don't sound out. They use pictures, they use context, and they try to figure out sounding out. But he said, this is how we all read. He called reading a guessing game. And he said children should be encouraged to guess what the words are, that the letters were actually irrelevant. And I'm repeating myself, but he noticed the kids made the most mistakes when they tried to sound out using just the first letter. He didn't deduce, he didn't use logical reasoning and get himself to the proper point. He never thought about the fact that these children had never learned to sound out words because they had been taught using this look-say method, right? They knew only to guess. And they made the most mistakes with phonics because they didn't know phonics. So instead of saying, this is how struggling readers read, and they're having a really hard time, because they did, they were misidentifying the words. It's not that they were reading well. He said, this is how all children should be taught to read. And sort of a new belief entered the schools that reading. So again, what happened so education and psychology have dovetailed in sort of a very inaccurate way. Research in linguistics was going on. Noam Chomsky was doing his work, and he identified that learning language is a natural process, pre-programmed into all of us humans. We will all learn how to speak if we're able to speak and hear, right? We all learn how to talk. No one ever gave us worksheets when we were learning to speak. We just figured it out. And so the education establishment made the broad leap that, okay, learning how to speak is natural, so is reading. And all you have to do is surround kids with books, read to them, get them to love it, and they will discover it. They will be so empowered or impassioned to want to learn how to read that they will figure it out for themselves. And all the teacher needs to do is give them a little guidance here and there. So that's why you would sometimes hear parents complaining, my child doesn't know how to read, words.
Learning the alphabet and this sort of structural approach and the phonics sort of falls away because in addition to this being a new hot theory, which, Americans always fall for and love anyway, it's new and improved and it'll make things easier. You have the kind of psychobabble coming out of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and this is a perfect fit because essentially it makes education less onerous, less by rote, more free, more creative, and it very much goes with the zeitgeist of that moment, which has nothing to do with science, but is kind of a more social construct. So by the time we get to your son in school, there's this method of teaching which you illustrate in the book where there's a picture and the beginning of a sentence, and then from the picture you're supposed to guess. So your son is sitting there trying to guess, it's something to do with, is it a sandwich? Is it a glass of milk? Finishing the sentence. And basically,
And the word was snack.
and the word is snack, but she's got milk, she has a sandwich, and he's guessing, and so forth and so on. He's never been given the weapons, as it were, to look and and figure it out. So there's no route into that other than guessing. And then you have this other picture of the kids who can all, quote, read a book, but of course they've had it read to them enough that they've actually memorized the book, which anybody who's read to little children knows. I mean, Goodnight Moon, you read it enough times and the kid, a 3-year-old, starts to know all the words. So I found that very interesting, the progression, but I just wanted to ask you this question, and then before we dive in some more, how much in terms of the kind of the culture of the moment of the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, which is kind of renegotiating all our presuppositions about how to do anything in life. And how much of that kind of American idea of, okay, we have a better way to do this, it's quicker, it's easier, how much is impacting the educational establishment? Now, what's the woman's name who never apologizes in Columbia?
Lucy Calkins.
Yeah. So where does she come from? Is she a culture warrior that is going to basically, are her ideas of education strictly academic, or is her academic approach and the wrong theories she has also part of the same culture that we're in, which is basically deconstructing everything? So, art's being reconsidered, films being reconsidered, sexual morality is being reconsidered, political commitment is being reconsidered. Learning to read was based on a system that was not just centuries, but millennia old. It went out the window at the same time that lots of other stuff was being questioned and thrown out the window. And now we're in a period of history where we're reconsidering, hey, what did we throw away there? Whether it's community stability or moving around a lot to chase your career, all kinds of things have come into our culture, which I think a whole generation is reconsidering. Do you look at your book as positioned within a pushback on that, or do you look at your book as, I'm just talking about reading? I'm just curious. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth.
I haven't thought about it, and I would need to think about it before I gave you a quick answer, because that's a really broad spectrum.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So it's sort of like when you undergo a trauma
Mm-hmm.
and you're undergoing the trauma and you're not really thinking about it, and then you
Right.
enter a period of reflection.
Right.
I think what's happened overall, and I'm just one of literally millions of parents that have experienced this, the pandemic opened this door
Sure.
for parents to see into the classroom for the first time. And all across the country, all of a sudden, parents realized, oh my God, my child isn't being taught how to read. My child isn't being taught how to do math. And
Yeah.
parents rose and fought, and the victory just happened. It's sort of like the battle literally just ended. And I don't think I have processed it, how it fits into a bigger picture other than our battle with reading and math and writing.
But it seems to me symptomatic of something else, and that is, and again, I'm not saying your book is about this, but I'm curious because you know a lot and you've seen all of this. But it seems to me to also be symptomatic of an age in which everything becomes therapy. So, for instance, your teachers don't use the word minus; they find some other way to say it. We don't want to be negative, and there's no correction. You write about this. And this is a cultural thing that comes very much out of my era in the 60s and 70s. So, no, we don't say you got it wrong. God forbid you got this wrong. That would be negative. That would be oppressive. There's a lot of the language that you mirror in your book from these teachers that it's very familiar to me, because this is straight out of hippy-dippy 1960s, 1970s. We don't say no. Of course, we never say no. We say, well, maybe there's a better way to do this than hitting your sister in the head with a brick. Maybe we should. And I don't think you can escape that inference in your book, because the language the teachers are using, which is driving you crazy because they're not teaching, the word no, or you got that wrong, or let's do, that's not the way to do this. That's part of their teacher training lingo. At least, that's in your book.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely.
But that's cultural. That's not just educational theory. That's
Hmm.
a cultural
Right.
moment.
It happens in sports where kids get trophies just for showing everybody gets a trophy. Not the winner, everybody gets a trophy. So
Yeah.
so yes. Yes.
Yeah, so that's, and I don't want to just brush over that because that's a big deal.
Hmm.
And again, this is not you at all, but we're in it. We're just coming out of an election cycle now where there's a huge pushback from what you might call the forces of traditionalism, Project 2025, Opus Dei and the Heritage Foundation, all these guys, you know, and this is not your book, but it seems to me that I'd like to ask you this. Don't you think some of the fury, the justified post pandemic fury where parents really got to look inside the classroom and saw that their kids were not being taught has to do with this sort of knee-jerk reaction against quote the whole system. I mean, we are talking about a project now which says let's get rid of the entire Department of Education.
Hmm.
Well, part of the parents that are being, this is not in a vacuum. I mean, I think your book is very apropos of the moment because it's like it could explain why some people who you would not think are part of the MAGA movement are just so pissed off that if anybody comes along and says, let's tear the whole system down when it comes to education, maybe they get a hearing they wouldn't have gotten at a period of history when teacher training hadn't become so much psychobabble in terms of
Hmm.
let's rethink everything. I don't know. I'm just tossing this out to you and then we'll talk more about the book.
Hmm.
What do you think? Because you've got your ear to the ground. I mean, what do you think?
I'm sorry, Frank. The what do I think? What is the specific
I
question?
mean, what do you think about the parental anger and what people are doing with it in the political context of the moment we're in, when everything seems to be up in the air, and we even have a proposal to defund the entire Department of Education? I mean, where does that come from?
I I talk with a lot of parents, and I think so many, it's hard for me to just say yes without an explanation.
Yeah,
So many parents are overworked and overburdened and just trying to survive their lives,
yeah,
like raising a family and having their child. And I think people are just, I'm just hearing it isn't becoming a bigger, from what I hear, a bigger, more global thing. It's just
right.
their kid can't read, and that's a tragedy, and that's what they're focused on. It's like when you bring your kid to an emergency room, you're not thinking about like the medical
No, of
system and
course
how
not.
it's broken and all that.
Yeah.
So I don't want to just say yes and agree without seriously giving this a big think.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I agree with it either, but I think that in the present political context, which is so frayed and so full of anger, when I read a book about a mother being you, who also happens to be a PhD in the air in a field which is apropos of this, and then you write, as I'm going to read from your book, no one knows what goes on behind closed doors certainly applies to kids' elementary schools. In no other area of life do parents so blindly turn their children over to unknown experts. We handpick our kids' pediatricians, dentists, and babysitters, but most parents send their kids off to school without asking any question about curriculums, teaching methods, or the kind of training teachers have received. Well, obviously, one of the huge things on the horizon now is both the defunding of public education, vouchers for private schools, a huge emphasis on parental guidance from a conservative point of view, and a kind of a resurgence of the homeschool movement, which I happen to know a lot about because I came out of it myself in that I came from an evangelical right-wing background and was, quote, homeschooled for a few years, which, was one reason I didn't know how to read either until I got to a real school in the United Kingdom, which was a boys' private school. So again, I come out of a world that was formed in reaction to what you might call kind of the same arc that happened within education in terms of a lot of areas. So I'm very aware of this. I would think that there's a lot of homeschool people who have pulled their kids entirely out of the system and are teaching them everything at home now, precisely because of the sort of things you're talking about. I mean, that's not a stretch, is it?
That is definitely not a stretch. And something else that I think is important to share is how upset teachers are too. It's so easy to globalize and say
Yeah.
the system, schools, teachers. But teachers are really horrified at how they have been trained and are
Yeah.
spending their own money. Teachers, some teachers,
Yeah.
right? Some schools have been doing a great job with reading.
Sure.
So I, I shy away from, making global statements,
Yeah.
but I've been doing a lot of podcast interviews, luckily for my book. When I say luckily, it's been eye-opening. It has been
Sure.
such an eye-opening experience. I thought I'd be informing people about the book, right? And informing people about
Yeah.
what's happened to children and what they need to know. And I have been so informed, and so many teachers, wonderful, bright, well-meaning teachers have left the system because
Yeah.
they wanted to teach correctly. They were told not to do it. You have to follow this system,
Yeah.
or they see kids being pushed through. I'm now volunteering at a school in Harlem, in a third grade classroom where 75% of those children have phonics knowledge that is at a kindergarten or first grade level. How
Yeah.
did those kids get to third grade? It is
Yeah.
so easy, Frank. It is so easy to teach a child to read if you do it correctly.
Yeah, and you say
But
that in the book, and toward the end of your book, and we're going to link to all these things. You have materials that you're producing yourself, by the way. The people listening to this who are parents can access, and we're going to link to all this when we put your book in the book club. And before that, Ernie, Greg, our producer, will do that. I want to just reintroduce you here. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I'm talking today to Dr. Daria, and she has written this incredibly good book, which I just finished reading today. I didn't believe him. My son told me his school wasn't teaching him to read. I told him to trust his teacher. This is the story of what happened next. And I'll mention, please subscribe right now on YouTube, and to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer at Apple Podcasts, and also to my Substack commentary, It Has to Be Said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And part of that is our It Has to Be Read book club, and we're going to make this book a March offering and keep talking about it. Let me get back into a section of the book here, and you say, sit down for this answer. It is so unbelievable that it will knock the wind out of you. Millions of children have not learned how to read because for over 100 years, a majority of teachers have had no idea how to teach a child to read. That's early in the book, just kind of pulling us in. If my only moment, this is somewhere else, if my only moment happened toward the beginning of my younger son Eric's kindergarten year, I was preparing dinner.
my if only,
My
my
if
if
only
only
moment, yeah, I
moment.
read that wrong. If only in quotes moment. When my 5-year-old walked into the kitchen and said, I want to learn how to read, Mommy, but my school isn't teaching me how to. And then later you say, in another part of the book, the teacher continued, when you read with your children at home, they will reach a word they don't know. Don't tell them how to sound it out. If they start sounding it out, tell them you could sound it out, but why would you want to do that when there are so many other strategies that are more effective? Okay, that's the way you're setting up what we're talking about here. So, why don't you explain a little more of that to us? Tell us the story of your own journey. You've got Eric, who's now what, 20, 23?
24.
Okay, see, I'm pretty close.
You're very good.
Yeah, I'm keeping track of the numbers. So I eventually learned enough math to do that. I'm only a year off. But tell us your story a little bit. We've been talking about the big theories and the moment we're in and the culture and politics. Just tell us Eric's story, give us a thumbnail, and then we'll get into more content on the book.
Sure. So Eric's story, we live in New York City. He went to a public school that is very rigorous academically, has an excellent reputation. You have to test to get into it. And I was in awe of this school. I did not know yet. Now I own a tutoring company in New York, so my knowledge is completely different than it was when this happened to us. But we didn't know that people prep for these tests. We just took them. He just showed up and he got in, and we were like, wow, amazing that he was accepted to this school. So he comes home when he's 5 years old and says, my school isn't teaching me how to read. And as you said, I told him to trust his teacher because I was so in awe of this school. It had such a wonderful reputation, tremendous test scores. I just really assumed they knew what they were doing. An entire year went by. His kindergarten year was an absolute nightmare for him. He is a very chatty, extroverted person. In the classroom, he began sitting towards the back of the room, sort of bowing his head in shame. I witnessed this once when I was in the classroom. I had no idea what was wrong. He began having nightmares. He dreamed that he was drowning. He was drowning in school. He wanted to learn how to read. His teacher wasn't teaching him. She was telling the kids to guess what the words were from the picture. His mother told him to trust the school. He had nowhere to turn, right? And as a psychologist that I quote in the book said, reading is what other kids see. You know, you could be doing algebra in kindergarten, and they still wouldn't think, you know, you're bright if you can't read. So he was so ashamed, and I thought he was reading because he brought home these books that he read. The first book he brought home was called, as you said, After School I Have a Snack. He could read other words like after school I play with my brother, after school I go to the playground. And I thought, he's reading just fine. He brought home, this is so important to mention, he brought home great grades in reading. His school graded on a 1 to 4 scale, with 4 being the highest. He had 3s and 4s in reading. Great report card. And in the meantime, what a horrible, horrible, horrible year this poor little boy had. And that summer, I realized he couldn't read a word. I took some books out of the library that were pretty basic, and I realized he had no idea how to read.
But in any case, yeah, he was memorizing the word
So I was just leading
like
up
a
to
picture.
I was just leading up to this punchline. This is how he got me to realize he couldn't read. He took a book. He came home in first grade. He said, "Mommy, you want to see how I read? I'll show you." Now, the reason I'm telling this story, this is a 5-year-old. How
Yeah,
could university professors and teachers, like, didn't teachers like stop to think, you know, like something's wrong here? All these kids, you know, seem not to be learning to read, but I'll tell you why teachers were fooled. But so this little boy, finally, it was like the thought that had to go into him doing this, because he didn't even know the word memorize at that point in his life, right? He didn't know the method was wrong. He didn't know what was wrong. He just knew something was wrong.
yeah,
So he couldn't tell me. So he showed me. He said, "Mommy, you want to see how I read? This is how I read." And he took a book. It was called Homes Are for People. He
yeah,
held it behind his back, and he quote unquote read it
yeah,
behind his back. He turned the page. A house is a home. Turned the page.
yeah.
A teepee is a home.
Hmm.
Turned the page. An apartment building is a home. And that was how I finally realized he had memorized
Yeah.
all those stories. He had no idea how to read. And that's when I realized I needed to get involved and figure out how to teach him how to. I had no
Something. Yeah.
idea at the time to teach him how to read. But I cringe to think what would have happened if he had not gotten through to me, because I really would have continued to believe his school. And I've realized, Frank, I've been on a lot of podcasts and, you know, live and learn. And I
Yeah.
sort of realized I've been burying the lead in all of these podcasts because I want people to read the book and experience it like a novel, right? What's going to happen? What's going
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
happen? But I think the very important point that needs to be sort of said to everyone is that this school took this bright little boy,
Yeah.
began saying, you know, he was making progress with me because the way I taught him was systematic and you could
Hmm.
gauge progress. Their way was just, if you've seen this word before and you've memorized it, you know how to read it, and that's how you move up in school. He
Yeah.
wasn't making progress in school. So they kept saying to me, they thought something was wrong with him. And I
Mm.
kept saying, nothing's wrong with him. He's making progress. That's what you ask yourself first.
Yeah.
Like, I
Yeah.
had a family come to me with their son. They were convinced he was dyslexic. They were about to have him evaluated. I said, wait a minute, let me teach him. Let's see if
See how
he
this
gets
works.
proper
Right.
instruction. Does he make progress? He
Yeah.
made instant progress.
Yeah.
But this school took this little boy, right? They
Mm.
evaluated him. We finally allowed them to evaluate
Yeah.
him.
And that's quite a saga in the story. I mean, you don't want to, and then your husband sort of talks you into it a little bit or whatever. You went back and forth for a bit, and finally you went ahead and did that.
And The evaluation found nothing wrong with him, right?
Yeah.
He was high average or superior in all areas. And even so, the school labeled him learning disabled
Yeah.
because his reading level did not match his high IQ.
Let me jump in for a second on one thing here. Tell me a little more before we get back to your story about the correlation between this sort of failure to teach to read and the failure to teach math, because two theories emerge in the same time frame, as it were, and the same kind of moment of history. One's on the math, one's on the reading. The result is similar. Just talk about that for a minute before we go any further.
So it comes again, it goes back to the 1920s and the progressive era, and this method of teaching, both in and also, well, and also the 60s with Piaget. But so there are two ways of teaching. There's the progressive method, which believes children learn best through discovery, through project-based learning. And in a progressive classroom, a teacher is considered a guide on the side.
Mm-hmm.
He or she is supposed to be guiding the students to the same knowledge. That got lost somewhere in translation. Now
Yeah.
it's just whatever you discover, you will learn. So kids leave these classrooms with different knowledge bases because one
Mm-hmm.
did a project on New Hampshire and the other one did a project on Maine. So one knows about New Hampshire, the other one knows about Maine. Whereas in a traditional classroom, a teacher is considered a sage on a stage, right? And stands there
Right.
and
They teach.
teaches traditionally. But in New York City, the public schools are progressive. And from what I have learned this past year, they seem to be progressive everywhere. So that progressive, it's why, parents come to me when their kids are in middle school and high school. My child doesn't know grammar. My child doesn't know vocabulary. My child
Right.
doesn't know. It's because these are not explicitly taught. It is
Yeah.
believed that children will discover this and construct their own knowledge. And in math, that's called constructivist math, where children, and oh my God, what I see, and again, I think I mentioned this, I own a tutoring company in New York. What I see
Yeah.
coming through the doors, your heart breaks. They have made math so complicated with they teach them 6 different strategies or expose them to 6 different strategies and then choose the one that works best for you. And the kids are just lost. They don't know which strategy to use.
Yeah.
They don't know how to use the strategy. And teachers are also, many teachers are against this. It's not that the teachers have all drank the Kool-Aid, right? But they have no choice. They're given this curriculum and they're told to teach it. And I
Yeah.
have seen videos that teachers make for their children where the teacher says, okay, you need to make these bars and divide them and do all this with division. And the teacher says, really, the division algorithm is much simpler. So if you know it, use it. But if you
Yeah.
don't, do this.
Yeah.
But they are told to use the curriculum that they're given to use. Some teachers close the door and they teach traditional.
What do you think, going back on these curriculums that clearly are failures and are there for other reasons than, pure science or academic? You can say whatever you want about it not having a political spin, but you've got an interesting anecdote in your book here about someone who I knew personally, because I come out of the religious right in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And you have a weird little thing that jumped off the page to me. One of the articles I found online was called "The Most Fulfilling Thing I've Ever Done" by Phyllis Schlafly. Yes, that Phyllis Schlafly, the woman responsible for derailing the adoption of the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution. I never imagined I would find use in anything Schlafly had written, yet here was this article. It had been written in 1992, 8 years before Eric was born, and its contents is still 100% applicable today. And then I think you quote her as saying, unless we are willing to become a society where only the elite can use the written language, mothers and fathers have to assume the responsibility of teaching their own children to read. It is obvious that the public schools either can't or won't do it. So you quote her. And again, it brings up this cultural question of mine because, I have a friend who's one of the best painters in the United States, actually 2 friends who are near-realist painters, one who's got a work down at the Met and somebody else that I've interviewed on this podcast. both of them had similar experiences back in the 60s and 70s in trying to go to art school. One was at RISD and one was somewhere else. At that point, it was all discover this all yourself, do installations, make it political. The one thing we're not going to teach you here is how to paint or draw. And so they came away as rebels because they actually wanted a structure and they had to find it themselves and they had to go back and do it. So there's no way your book can avoid me saying, look, this is part of something larger. And this deconstruction of educational tradition and the kind of psychologizing of it in some ways, part of the zeitgeist, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. Okay, it may go back into the 1920s and before that, but if you want to roll it back a little further, it goes right back into the French Revolution and the Jacobites. Let's tear everything down, start over again, overthrow the system, push back against the hierarchy. We have nothing to learn from the Roman Catholic Church. We have nothing to learn from tradition. By the way, I'm an atheist liberal, in case you're wondering where I'm coming from. But one thing that we now see as a pattern developing into modern history and the kind of deconstruction of art, literature, and so forth and so on is we all love Shakespeare, but the tools that gave Shakespeare the ability to write were, of course, a structured education where he was learning Latin and he was learning Greek and he was doing math in a way that would have been oppressive and by rote. And somehow we think out of just discovering, we put a pile of sand, words, tools, a couple of paintbrushes, go express yourself. That's a little bit facetious, but that was basically the zeitgeist of the 60s, but it wasn't just in reading and writing. So you have to go there a little bit because, you're quoting Schlafly as having said something true, which is very incorrect for right now, because she's just part of, that terrible right-wing reaction. And yet here she was part of something, and I knew her personally. Yes, she was anti-feminist, but she was also pushing back against the idea that there are no rules about anything. And out of that came a homeschool movement, which is now at the base through the Heritage Foundation of the program that Trump wants to put into practice, not because he cares about education, but because he is cashing in on a big, big reaction to 200 years of liberal folly in the other direction. It's just a pile of sand and some tools and this, go figure it out. And there's parents out there saying, well, why can't my kid read? So there is something going on here. I hate to keep coming back to it.
Mm-hmm. I wish I was more informed and could speak more intelligently on the area. It's just, I'm just not informed enough. I'm not saying yes or no. Yeah. I can tell you the Republicans have had it right with reading instruction. No one can argue that.
Yeah.
And it turned into Kenneth Goodman, who believed in this whole language guessing game. He was very liberal. And so ironically, it turned into the Democrats, supposedly care for the, lower income members of our society and for helping everyone. And it's been the Democrats who kept this in the classroom because they wanted everyone to have a right, for the child to have a right. And the Republicans wanted the traditional method of education. Just from talking to people and knowing so many of these people, I think for these people in general, it was not part of some broader, bigger, nefarious, plot. These people who were teaching in this method genuinely believed that what they were doing worked. They weren't on purpose not teaching children how to read. The mistake was not letting go of their beliefs when the research was definitively proven in the year 2000. And I'm going back to reading, not because it's just what I know, right? I don't know about many of these broader things. The 60s, I was still a baby, so I didn't live through that. So I just, I don't know. You know much more than I do, and I'm really very impressed with your cultural knowledge, and I'm going to do some more reading. I had
the unenviable privilege, if you want to put it that way, of living on both sides of the issues. I come from a right-wing evangelical family that looked at, quote, all these liberals very much as Phyllis Schlafly did. And that's why I know her personally or knew her. And then I changed sides. And I describe myself as a progressive person now with a lot of liberal views on a lot of things that would have shocked my old self when I was in my 20s. You know, you talk in your book, you say, I looked up, a fellow first grade mother was standing next to my table. She looked down at the book spread out before me. Then she looked at me. What are you doing? I told her what I had just witnessed in Eric's classroom. My voice flat with shock. I said, that school is not teaching our kids to read. I know, she said, shaking her head in disgust. You know, your interaction with other parents experiencing the same thing is a very poignant part of your book. And it strikes me that, you know, we can ignore the larger cultural moment. But on the other hand, I think one thing you key in on very closely, of course, if you really want to touch people's lives where they care most about it, mess with their children. And when
Right.
your kid comes back from school and can't read, and everybody in your family can do math better than they can, and then someone suggests, for instance, that the problem here is identity politics, that have identified the fact that certain groups of minority kids can't do it, then the whole system lowers its standard in order to be kind. That's the liberal idea.
Do you
And
know
then,
some?
but the people who suffer most are the people who needed the basics. You're not doing anybody a favor. And that is what the right has been saying, with a great deal of unkindness. And I'm asking you about your experience in the New York public schools, which have a broad spectrum of minority students, majority students, Asian, Black, African American, whatever. This has to have been part of some of the problem in New York City, the attempt to be kind, then backfiring on the very students who needed the basics the most. Seems to me that's a pattern.
It's I'm not sure it was an attempt to be kind. I think it was misguided teachers teaching in a misguided way.
Yeah,
The children not learning how to read. Nothing gets me angrier than hearing people say, "Oh, you know, it's just to be expected that minority students like Black or Hispanic
yeah,
aren't reading well."
yeah, yeah,
Those children are as capable as any other children. And my sons, both of them, their best friends in high school were Black.
yeah,
Both of those boys went on to Ivy League schools,
yeah,
and both of those boys went on to Ivy League schools because of their mothers. Like,
yeah,
you know, I have an essay that I want to write called Why You Should Be an Obama Mama,
yeah,
because Obama's mother subscribed him to correspondence courses when they were living in Indonesia. And Obama, when he was little, and he would complain about having to get up early and do the work. And she said to
mm,
him, you know, this isn't a picnic for me either, Buster,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
But she realized the schools were not giving her child what he needed, and she got it for him. And that is like the one thing I would want to get across. You know, we can politicize it, and you know, I would love I would love to have dinner with you and have this conversation. But I'm afraid to politicize it because I don't think it is political on the ground in the classroom.
right.
I think there you have teachers who, you know, they went to education school. I think many of them are not political. They certainly don't have that in their heads. They're just trying to teach these kids how to read.
Mm,
The kids aren't learning. And you know, in now I'm at a school in Harlem. I tend to go for the underdog, right? And there's a little
right.
girl in this classroom who doesn't even know her short vowels. I found out only recently, she lives in a homeless shelter, made it her tug at my heart even more, right? I'm going to
Yeah,
help this girl. I go up to the school to help the girl. She's absent. And then she's absent the next day. And then she's absent again the following
mm,
day. And the parent is the only parent who didn't show up for parent-teacher conferences. Then your heart goes out to the teacher, right?
yeah,
There are
yeah,
so many, 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 many factors at play. I mean, let's like, you know, so many Black families are now very well educated and their kids are going to Harvard and their kids are excelling.
yeah,
Like we can no longer just say Black or Hispanic or Ukrainian. I'm Ukrainian, right? I'll throw myself in there, you know, and
right.
just stereotype. It's become just parents who know they can't trust the school and parents who don't know. There's a Hispanic father who wants his daughter to learn English. She can't speak English. We
Mm.
sent home one of my workbooks. I gave him one of my workbooks. Work with her and teach her these words because she can sound out beautifully. This girl can sound out, but she doesn't know what the words mean.
Sure.
Doesn't that show you how easy it is to teach a kid to sound out? But there
Yeah,
you have a
exactly.
parent who's willing to help and can help. And I
Mhm.
think the most important thing is to, you think global and big picture and cultural issues, which is wonderful. And I think very, little picture individual child. And I think, yes, of course, there are these things. The education issue became politicized to its great detriment. Like
Yeah, but
when
the thing is, I think part of the way that it's repaired is by admitting that and admitting the fact that a lot of what has come from the academic community of the left, and I am of the left, but a lot of what has come from our community has been politicized, but has been sold as science. So when you get to this question here, the research, and this is from your book, definitively showed that phonics was a necessary part of teaching kindergarten and first graders how to read. Phonics was one of the 5 necessary components, and it was a crucial starting point. Without phonics, kids would never get off the ground. Headlines across the country trumpeted that the reading wars were over and phonics had won. The general public assumed whole language would immediately vacate the classroom. It did not. Okay, why did not? Because getting back to the bigger picture, and the power of the educational establishment, the Ivy League schools, the people that are accepted by them have an afterlife even when something is disproved that just continues. And that's where this kind of false kindness comes in, where they're pitching it as somehow part of an identity politics program of helping people. It's not at all. That's part of their excuses for keeping going with this crap
right,
after it's been disproved. And
and
it's no
making money.
favor to minorities.
Absolutely, absolutely, I agree 100%.
Yeah. So that's all I'm trying to make a point
Absolutely,
here.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So let me just go to something here that I thought I was going to ask you to explain here. Lucy Calkins, a professor of literacy at the Teachers College, Columbia University, and the creator of one of the most widely, quote, balanced literacy reading curriculums in the country. It was her curriculum that Mayor Bloomberg mandated into all New York City schools. And it is her book, The Art of Teaching Reading, which you read about in chapter 1, that tells teachers to have kindergarten and first grade kids pretend to read. Okay, so then you go into the fact that neither has she withdrawn anything or apologized, nor has Columbia University. So talk about the way they've backtracked. But because they didn't apologize and just say we were wrong, what are the ill effects of that? In other words, does the system they have seen proved wrong for whatever political reasons, they don't back down? Columbia is a really bad actor here in your book and in lots of ways, I think, on all sorts of issues when it comes to this sort of liberal religion pushing against all structure and saying, no, we'll just all be creative here instead. It's part of a bigger picture, but specifically to lose her and Columbia, what's the story there to the present day? They haven't backed down. This theory is still being used. You're a tutor because you're trying to interact in a remedial way with many people, including by the kids of some famous clients of yours that are in your, the blurb about your book, Kate Winslet and these other people, kind of a who's who of clients. So little side issue there. After you've answered my question, tell me how it is you managed to tutor so many famous children or famous people's children. I'm so interested in that. We'll get to that in a minute, but just talk about where we are now. Bring us up to speed. Columbia hasn't apologized. She hasn't withdrawn anything. She still can be Googled and found online. How have these people remained respectable?
So Columbia has not apologized. She has not apologized. If anything, she says she has always been for phonics, which just
Right.
makes your head spin. Columbia has distanced, but things have changed. Columbia has distanced itself from her. Columbia has closed down the department that she had been in charge of and is now saying that it is hiring professors who are knowledgeable in the science of reading. Lucy Calkins has changed her curriculum. So the current curriculum does have phonics lessons in it. It does have decodable readers. Very interesting, though. She still packages reading and phonics as two separate things. But there's a complete lack of trust now. I know the Palo Alto School District, a man who is on the school board there, recently has said that they would never use her curriculum again because there's the issue of trust. She this is my I've been struggling to try to understand this woman because I just really don't. I think initially she really believed that she was right. Then I was actually privy to a series of uh, training sessions that she gave for teachers, and I joined them. I was invited to join them because I had asked for information about the curriculum. And behind the scenes, off camera, she says, it was like putting on glasses and seeing the world in a different light. She admits that her entire orientation changed.
Right.
I think she might be afraid of liability. Most likely that's the case because families have sued states, and won. In Michigan,
Yeah.
families sued because their
Yeah,
kids
that's in
weren't
your
learning.
book that they
Yeah.
sued and won. Yeah.
And in California, I think she's probably afraid of liability. So she says, I have always believed in phonics. What people need to realize is, phonics, it's like saying, I believe in love or I believe in marriage, right? Love is
Right.
different for every relationship and every marriage is different. There's not like one thing. So like phonics is that almost equally broad, where
Yeah. Yeah.
there's explicit systematic phonics where you are teaching children first short vowels, then blends, and then words with CH, and then words with, long vowels. You go in a progression, you
Mhm.
assess, you make sure they learn, and you teach. But then there's phonics, the way Lucy Calkins probably justifies it to herself and makes her able to sleep at night. Did she believe in phonics always? If you just use the word phonics, you actually can say yes, because children were taught the sounds of the letters, but
Mhm.
they were taught to use those letter sounds when they write in something called invented spelling.
Yeah.
So the word of, which of course is spelled OF, in invented spelling, children would spell the way they hear it, UV.
Right.
So that does them no good when they see the word of when they're reading, right? And they still don't know how to really spell of. But that was part of this discovery method, that children will discover these words as they write.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did not work. But that is also phonics, right? Teaching them to
Sure.
recognize the sounds of letters. So I have to think that's how she justifies what she is saying, but it's a whole, she's hired a big PR company. She's got a PR company behind her, really, I think, protecting her and protecting her from liability.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me just fast forward here. Toward the end of your book, you offer materials, and I would like to make sure, and Ernie will talk to you about this. By the way, when I sign off here, please stay on and talk to Ernie a little bit so we can get all the connections of things. And I have another favor to ask you. Besides giving Ernie everything you want us to link to help promote what you're doing, which we thoroughly believe in, and we love your book and we think you're great. I think you're great. I won't speak for Ernie. He probably does too by this point. But one question I have for you is just to make sure you give Ernie the names of anybody else we ought to be talking to, because we always ask for other guests. Oh, he just texted me and says, I do. He thinks you're great too.
Oh, thanks, guys. I think you're great
Yeah,
too.
we both think you're great. Unanimity, two people. But anyway, yeah, we want you to stay on and talk to Ernie about anybody else we ought to interview on this. And it can be an author, a famous person, a parent, nobody at all, but someone with someone to say. Just give Ernie some names because we get some of our best guests that way.
Sure.
And I just want to go back and say, I didn't believe him. My son told me he wasn't, his school wasn't teaching him to read. I told him to trust his teacher. This is the story of what happened next. That's the book we're talking about. In looking at this, you talked about, let me just go here where I want to go. your son had written something backward, and I put me three exclamation parts in my note. I thought he had written backwards on purpose. Wow, I said, how did you do that? What do you mean? My blood ran cold. Eric had no idea he had written, I love you, M backward. That was a problem, a big problem. You wrote the first line backwards, I said, in a lighthearted tone, as if I had done something fun and interesting. I did, as if he had done something fun and interesting. I did. Eric squinted at the letters, but didn't seem to realize there was anything wrong. So I just want to say that one of the strengths of this book is that you kind of go through in a very micro manner your own struggles as a parent, which is something I really could identify with as not just a parent, but for the last 16 years now, I've been doing most of the childcare along with my wife, Jeannie, for my three grandchildren that live across the street. And of course, so we're grandparents, but we're very much, my youngest grandchild is 10 of the three that live across the street, 116. Jeannie and I got pregnant when we were 17 and 18. So I have a 50-year-old daughter who lives in New York City as an executive in a company there. We have the whole span, and a son who's a teacher and someone else who's somebody in a school. I have so many personal connections with your life and struggles. And I just want to say, you said you hope people read the book as a novel, but okay, you're willing to give it away. That I think the brilliance of your book is that you really tell your story so well when it comes to Eric and his struggles. And then you draw the broader conclusion on reading. And although I've been asking you some political questions that are kind of loaded in a way, the book is not that. It's your story, it's his story, and it's a how-to on how to really teach to read. So I want to ask you one more question. Has anybody climbed down on this crappy way of teaching math and gone back to basics, or are we still in some loopy, far-off country of fancy ideas and there's 10 ways of doing this?
We're still in some loopy, far off country. It's better than it was. The
Yeah.
traditional algorithm is taught as one of the strategies to children, but not always. Even long division, they don't do it the way you and I would do it. They break it down like 12 into, 1,462. They
Yeah.
would guess how many times 12 goes into that whole big number, and
Hmm.
then multiply and subtract and then keep going and going and going. So it takes about 6 pages to do that kind of guesswork. It's just ridiculous.
Is part of the way that people can get away with this now is they all count on what's in your phone anyway. So who needs to learn anything? Because you just sort of say, Siri, tell me divide 750,000 by 126.
It might be why some people are not up in arms against it, but no, there are, people believe in this. They believe in it. They think this is how children learn. It's changing. Like now there's something called the science of reading, which really pulls together what all the research studies have
Yeah.
shown. There's a real push for the science of math to happen. I know professors at Stanford came out in a big way about 20 years ago against this math without much change happening.
Yeah.
But hopefully change will come down the pike for math too, like it has for reading. The reading really is beginning to change because teachers have become aware. That's why I keep this, I think, a little bit more on a personal level, because
Yeah.
when we talk about ideas, it's easy to depersonalize it and say, and have this interesting theoretical conversation. But
Mhm.
the like boots on the ground fact is, until teachers believe it, until teachers subscribe for it,
Yeah.
until teachers are willing to lose their jobs over it and close the door and teach in the right way, change will not happen.
Yeah.
And teachers have gotten on board now with the science of reading. They're writing letters to their schools of education complaining about, their education. The schools of education are afraid of losing money. So now some are beginning, to change is slowly happening.
Mhm.
And I really do think it's against the law now in 10 states to teach reading the way Eric was taught to read, against the law.
Well, that
That's
makes sense. Hey, what states are those? I'm curious. Is that South, North, red states, blue states? What is it?
Arkansas, Florida, Indiana, Louisiana, have it written down here, North Carolina, Ohio, South Carolina, Texas, West
Yeah.
Virginia, and Wisconsin.
Yeah. So basically, we're talking red states with one purple being Wisconsin. And so the wave of the future is going to be conservative when it comes to this. And unfortunately, that will politicize it. But you're arguing for the actual science.
Mm-hmm.
of it. So you say, I went to the kitchen to make lunch, and from there I saw Eric walk over to the books. He picked up a book about a boy named Brady who was obsessed with hockey, leafed through it for the first few pages, and then sat down at the coffee table and began reading it. I froze. He had just picked up a book and was reading it on his own. I didn't know what to do. Should I praise him for reading? No, that might make him self-conscious and ruin his enjoyment. I love that because, again, the personal touch is so fetching there. I'm on Team Eric.
I have a question for you, but before
Yeah,
we end,
go
because you said
ahead.
something very interesting. You said you were homeschooled and you thought that was one reason that you did not learn to read until later.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I lived in a sort of this will sound weird. I lived in a kind of a 1960s fundamentalist Christian hippie commune in the Swiss Alps run by Americans with most backpackers stopping because they thought it was a free place to stay. It was totally free form. I would run around in the Alps all day long. It didn't work when it came to learning how to read and write. I had some formal people. People would have a job in the community to take care of little Frankie here, see if you can teach him something. Fortunately, all the books were were Victorian era phonics, books. So actually, everything I learned in a traditional way. And then when I got to a British boys' school called Great Wallstead in Sussex, Mr. and Mrs. Park ran it. They were lovely people. And basically, they just regarded me as sort of behind in everything. And they would say things like, every word on the page here is misspelt, but the ideas are good. You just need to learn to spell because, they were realists. They were saying at some point you'll need to do some things. And so I got a lot of private tutoring there all along the lines that you're advocating. These were straight up 1950s, 60s. I might as well have been in 1900 a Victorian school. And they saved me because essentially it wasn't just teaching. It was the first structured experience I'd ever been part of. Where I came from was all Bible studies and run around in the mountains. And so I had a very unstructured beginning that sort of gelled. Actually, many years later, when I was in my 60s, I flew back to England when they were very, very old people, just in order to thank them, because the 5 years I had with them literally changed my life. They were the only people who gave me any formal structure when it came to everything. So basically, my own educational background was very, very fraught, and it's all mixed up with religion and weird politics. And then in the 60s and 70s, I knew people like Phyllis Schlafly because we were very much on her side. So obviously, I bring that lens to what I do here on this podcast with you by looking at your book always in a wider context of having sort of lived bits of it. And I really love your book. I think it's great. And I hope everybody reads it. Is there anybody doing work like you're doing about reading in the area of taking on how math is taught? My son teaches physics and math at a swanky private school and has the robotics team that I told you about that won the world championship, Wolfpack, and helps MIT now put together their program, et cetera, et cetera. He runs into kids who have to be retaught math, who come from other schools where they just never learned anything. And one of the problems he has is the zeitgeist of the moment is so therapeutic. It's like, well, won't this harm somebody's self-esteem if you tell them they are getting it all wrong? And he works with parents that would sort of want their kids to just keep being passed through. But he hasn't put together a world champion robotics and coding team based on the fact that we pretend the wrong answer is the right answer. So I am in this discussion all the time with him. And his problem is not just the students, it's dealing with parents who come from a very upscale, Harvard-centric, liberal elite, if you want to just put it in harsh terms, who it's all about their kids feeling self-esteem, not necessarily always about a non-therapeutic, let's just learn and do the basics approach here. So it's something that I live with because I talk to him a lot.
Wow. I have not personally come across that, so this is fascinating to me. Like I work with parents who, yes, they're aware of their kid's self-esteem, but they want their kid to know the traditional way of learning. So it's funny. There's a man who wrote an article for the LA Times a long time ago already, I think in the year around when the National Reading Panel released its results. And he was saying his daughter goes to this fancy, trendy private school and they're not teaching her how to read, but
Yeah.
that the parents there didn't care because, and I think this is what Phyllis Schlafly meant by only the elite can read. The
Yeah.
parents didn't care because the parents could afford to pay for tutoring. So
Yeah.
anytime the school is failing, because there's so much more to these schools and especially to private schools where they're almost like clubs, right?
Yeah.
And you feel a
Yeah.
part of it. And okay, they're not doing such a great job with this. We can supplement this at home. I'm not going
Yeah.
to complain to the school because I want to continue being part of the club, but we will use our own, private wealth to
Yeah.
pay for tutoring. And that is what is done. I mean, in New York City, it is the exception for a child to not be tutored in
Yeah.
public school and private school.
And that doesn't even count everybody tutoring them on how to get into college and, writing their essays. And then now you have artificial intelligence. And are they using that? What the hell's going on? I mean, I think that you scratch the surface of a problem that's so big that I think it really does have, political applications these days.
Mm-hmm.
And people are worried about, all sorts of aspects of the system that don't seem to be working. I mean, cut to the chase, thinking of your sons and the fields they've gone into. You can be sure that when Elon Musk hires the guys to design those rockets for him, they can do division and they know how to
Exactly.
add.
Exactly.
And, you can say, well, that's, right wing, tyrannical, blah, blah, blah. But the movers and shakers in the tech bro culture, which I'm not particularly fond of, it's just on the basis of hubris and Greek myth and what happens to people who think they own the world. All the stories I've read that doesn't end well, but you have a coterie of people who are demanding standards and saying, the people we hire have to have these standards. They've got to actually know how to do some shit. It can't just all be talk and therapy.
Right. And learning those skills like math, it hones your brain in a way for analytical thinking. It's not just about math. Of course, it's about math, but
Yeah,
it's about
sure.
how your brain works and the thinking process. And so many kids now, they don't read the directions and they're not held to, they don't take notes. It's
Right.
just, I really feel for kids. It's not easy being in school these
Well,
days.
and the context in which we're doing everything with social media and all these shortcuts we're offering to people. I mean, who needs to learn how to read a map? Who needs to do anything? It's all there in this machine that we carry around. But then when push comes to shove, and you're like me, who still doesn't spell well, I can spell a lot better than I used to. Spell check doesn't offer me 16 ways to choose between. So if I misspell dyslexic, it will, and when I get enough letters in the word, so my algorithm knows what I'm trying to do, it doesn't say, choose one of these three, whichever you like will be fine.
Right.
So sooner or later, I use that as a little metaphor for the fact that sooner or later, the world is not full of infinite possibilities. And I think the same thing goes for relationships. My wife and I have been together 54 years. People say, well, how did you do this? Well, yes, all relationships are different, but unless there's some toleration, unless there's some forgiveness, unless there's some empathy, unless there's some care, unless there's helping the other person live their dreams, it's not going to work. Now, that can be different with different couples, but there's not 50 ways to do this. And there's not 50 ways to learn math or learn to read. Sooner or later, you're either hired to work on, whatever it is, or you're not. So the reality is going to hit at some point because not everything can always be in your phone. You actually have to know some shit.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And there is one way to spell dyslexic, and I can't do it, but my machine knows how. On that note, I'm going to thank you for your book and tell everybody once again that this was In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And I've been talking to Irene Daria, and she has written this incredible book. I want you to all to read it, and it's going to be in the book club. So 1 minute, but you've got all these fancy people you teach their kids to read. How did that start? Because you're working in Harlem and you're tutoring people who are homeless, but you also have Kate Winslet's kids or whomever. Who are some of the famous people? Leave us on a sexy, fun Cosmo Vogue magazine.
So some children of famous people who I have taught, and it's just like famous people are just like us. They have
You know
kids, they
that.
worry about their
Yeah.
kids, they want their kids to do well. So Kate Winslet, who is lovely, she used to live in New York City. I tutored her two older children. She's now living in England.
Yeah.
Kate Winslet came to me through my son's former preschool. Kate Blanchett was here for a few months working on a play, so I tutored two of her sons. Tom Brady's son with Bridget Moynihan, we taught him how to read. Philip Seymour Hoffman's son, we worked with him on reading comprehension. So that really is a
And then
function
he
of
went on and had a good part in Licorice Pizza, if that's the same son of
is
Seymour
it? I
Hoffman.
didn't even know that.
Yeah,
Really?
yeah. I mean,
Oh,
he did well. Yeah, that
Cooper?
he was in the
Oh,
movie. I'm not sure
oh,
it's Cooper. One of his kids was in the movie, and I'm thinking, yeah, the apple did not fall far
oh.
from the tree. He's a good actor.
I have to look that up.
Licorice Pizza is a good movie, by the way. It's one of my
Okay.
favorites. Yeah.
So,
And
so
who else? Come on, a few more names. Anybody else?
So that's a few more not in reading in other areas, but those are
Yeah,
the main ones
those are the cool
in
ones.
reading.
Good. Well,
Bob,
hey,
Bob Kerrey, former governor of Nebraska,
yeah.
his son.
Yeah,
Um,
and then people who access your materials, as we'll link to on this, can get hold of stuff so we can get some practical things from your things for parents who are either homeschooling and or just trying to supplement the school but still not doing the job, whatever. There is hope. You've got materials for them. Do you point them towards other people's materials as well, say in the area of math? It's not about reading, but other.
I will. I have been so busy with completing this book and running the tutoring company. I have plans for putting a whole library of information on my website.
Good.
So in time, absolutely yes. Right
Good.
now it's
Well,
reading.
we, yeah, that's great. Well, I very much enjoyed talking to you. Stay on and talk to Ernie. Give us names of people we should talk to. Tell us how to promote your work. And then you can share this interview with people on your stuff because I think that, you certainly made a good case for what you're doing. So this was great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank. Really enjoyed talking with you.
Yeah, me too. And we will do that meal sometime and dig into everything.
Love it.
If you're up in the Boston area, let me know. And next time I'm in New York, I'll get in touch with you. Come see what that mirror behind you really looks like.
Okay,
All
perfect.
right. Hey, take care. Much love. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.